I held his hand that night when his heart beat unevenly, and his eyes looked at me with a silent plea. We had been married for 60 years, and I knew every breath he took. He had once promised me that he would never let me suffer, and I had promised him the same. When I took the final step, I did not think of the court, of people, or of laws. I thought only of him. But now, behind the barbed wire, everyone calls it murder. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Helen Brooks, and I was 72 years old when the quiet of our Ohio home turned into something closer to a hospice ward. I had worked most of my life as a librarian, surrounded by shelves that smelled of paper and ink, where silence was filled with whispers of turning pages. In retirement, I had thought my house would carry the same silence, gentle, familiar, and warm. But the silence that came with my husband's illness was of another kind. It pressed on the chest, it stretched across the rooms like heavy curtains, and it reminded me with every passing hour that love, no matter how strong, could not stop the body from surrendering. Robert had been my partner for more than 6 decades. I still saw him in flashes. A young man with dark hair carrying boxes into our first apartment, a father running across the backyard with children chasing after him, a steady presence at the head of the table during long Sunday dinners. But now he lay in the living room, where we had moved his bed so the paramedics would not have to navigate the narrow staircase. The bookshelves around us, once bursting with novels and encyclopedias, seemed to lean toward him, as if even the stories of other lives were bending under the weight of his decline. The house smelled different. It was no longer the scent of coffee brewing in the morning or pies cooling on the counter. It was the metallic tang of medication, the faint sting of rubbing alcohol, the sweetness of overripe fruit I left on the windowsill to mask the sterile air. The hum of the oxygen machine became the rhythm of our days. Its constant drone was both a lifeline and a reminder of how fragile his breaths had become. At night, I would lie awake and count the uneven intervals of his inhalations, afraid that one would be the last. I spent my mornings arranging his pills in small containers, the colors of capsules and tablets forming mosaics that meant survival for one more day. I kept notes taped to the fridge, reminders of doses and times, as if writing them down could keep chaos away. The nurses who visited spoke in measured tones, glancing at me with professional pity. They adjusted tubes, changed linens, and left quickly, their footsteps echoing through the hallway. When the door closed, the house fell back into its heavy silence, and I would sit beside him, holding a hand that once felt unshakable, but now was paper thin and cold. Our marriage had been built on rituals, small, ordinary things that now returned to me like ghosts. He used to whistle when he shaved. Now the bathroom mirror was spotless, unused for months. He once insisted on mowing the lawn even after the children begged him to hire someone. Now the grass grew higher than ever, and I no longer had the strength to push the mower. We had kept a clock above the mantelpiece that ticked faithfully for half a century, its hands moving steadily through the rise and fall of our life together. Now each tick seemed too loud, as though time itself was mocking me for daring to believe it would always stretch ahead of us. I tried to keep the house in order, though it felt like dust settled faster than I could wipe it away. The walls carried memories in every scratch and stain. The spot in the kitchen where Robert had dropped a pot of tomato sauce years ago, leaving a faint red shadow that never fully came off. The dent on the stair rail where one of our grandchildren had collided during a holiday game of tag. The faded wallpaper in the dining room, yellowed by decades of family gatherings and candlelight. Every detail spoke of life, and yet, all around me, life was slipping away. There were moments when I caught my reflection in the window and hardly recognized myself. My hair, once carefully pinned before going to the library each morning, now hung loosely, streaked with more gray than silver. My clothes smelled faintly of disinfectant. My hands, once used to turn the delicate pages of books, now trembled as they lifted spoons of broth to his lips. The woman in the glass seemed more nurse than wife, yet behind her tired eyes there still flickered the devotion of a girl who had fallen in love with a man in uniform returning from war. I thought often about promises, not the vows we had spoken in a church long ago, though they echoed in me still, but the unspoken ones, the agreements made over a lifetime. We had promised each other laughter, forgiveness, and respect. But the deepest promise had come later, whispered in the dark, after hearing about friends who had suffered long illnesses. He had said he did not want to linger in pain, and I had pressed his hand in mine, silently assuring him that I would not let him. I carried that promise now, like a stone in my pocket, heavy and undeniable. The neighbors sometimes knocked to ask if we needed groceries or help with the yard. I always thanked them, always said we were fine. I did not want them to see him this way, to remember him as a shadow. I wanted them to hold on to the image of Robert as the tall man who fixed fences, who shoveled snow from their driveways in winter, who told jokes at block parties that made everyone laugh until they wiped tears from their eyes. I guarded his dignity like a secret, even as the illness stripped more and more from him each day. Evenings were the hardest. The house grew darker earlier, and the silence thickened until it was almost unbearable. I would light a small lamp near his bed and sit with a book in my lap, pretending to read, though my eyes blurred over the same sentence again and again. Sometimes he stirred, his eyes opening just enough to find mine, and I would see both gratitude and sorrow there. It was in those moments that I felt time folding in on itself, as though all the years we had shared compressed into the space between his frail hand and mine. The days blurred together, each one a repetition of the last, yet each carrying us closer to an ending we both felt but never named. The house itself seemed to know. Floorboards creaked softer, air stood still longer, shadows stretched farther. Love still lived there, but it was love holding on, not love growing. And I understood, with a clarity that frightened me, that my role had changed. I was no longer the wife who built a future with him. I had become the guardian of his final days, the witness to his leaving. I told myself that enduring this slow unraveling was a form of devotion, that by staying, by watching, by caring, I was honoring the life we had built. Yet beneath it all, I carried a question that refused to rest. How long should love watch someone suffer before it dares to act? The thought had taken root long before it ever reached the surface of my actions. It began in quiet moments, when the lamp by his bed cast a pale light on his face, and I saw not only the man who had shared 6 decades with me, but also the weight of suffering pressing down on him. I knew his expressions as well as I knew my own, and I recognized the silent plea hidden in the tightening of his jaw, in the tremor of his lips when he tried to speak but could not find the strength. It was not a plea for help in the ordinary sense. It was a plea for release. I remembered years ago, in healthier days, when we had spoken of what it meant to age together. We had laughed about our bodies betraying us, about the aches that would one day slow our walks, or the glasses we would lose on the nightstand. But beneath the laughter, there had been an unspoken gravity. He had told me once, while we were sitting on the porch at dusk, that he did not want to linger if lingering meant only pain. He said it not as a command, but as a confession, as though he hoped I would understand without needing to answer. I had squeezed his hand then, not fully comprehending what it might one day demand of me. That moment returned to me now, with the weight of inevitability. The days became heavier, filled with endless repetition of medicine schedules, whispered reassurances, and nights broken by his cries of discomfort. Each morning I rose with the hope that perhaps this day would be different, that the illness might ease its grip, but every evening ended with the same bitter truth. Hope became a cruel ritual, something I clung to even as it dissolved in my hands. Slowly, I began to understand that the only mercy left to him was one that the world would never forgive me for granting. The decision did not strike me like lightning. It crept closer with each labored breath he took. It sat beside me when I measured out his pills, when I cleaned his frail body, when I tried to feed him spoonfuls of broth he no longer wanted. It followed me into the kitchen when I stood staring at the worn wooden table where we had once eaten meals as a family. The house whispered it to me in its silence, in the way the clock ticked indifferently while his body fought battles it could not win. I walked to the pharmacy one afternoon with steps that felt heavier than lead. The bright lights of the store, the cheerful voices of strangers, the endless shelves of supplies. They all seemed cruelly out of place compared to the shadow I carried within me. My hands shook as I reached for what I needed, items so ordinary that no one would suspect the extraordinary purpose they would serve. I placed them in a basket as though I were buying bread or milk, but inside me there was a storm, a trembling knowledge that I was preparing not for life, but for death. Back at home, I arranged everything with the meticulous care of someone trying to impose order on chaos. Bottles lined up neatly, a glass placed beside them, water ready. Each object carried a double meaning. To the world, they were medicine, but to me, they were a promise kept. I stared at them for a long time, my heart pounding in my ears, as though waiting for some voice to intervene and stop me. No voice came. There was only the steady hum of the oxygen machine, a metronome counting down the moments. I asked myself again and again if this was love or betrayal. The lines blurred until I could no longer separate them. Love had always been about presence, about holding on through storms, about standing beside him when the world collapsed. But now love meant letting go, even if it shattered me in the process. I knew I could endure his decline for months, perhaps even years, but I also knew he could not. Every fiber of me screamed that prolonging his suffering was a cruelty far greater than the act I contemplated. In the stillness of night, I began to picture what it would mean. The quiet room, his head resting against the pillow, my hand in his, the final moment when pain would finally release its grip. I rehearsed it in my mind, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. I needed to be certain, to face the truth with open eyes. The images became sharper each time, as if my heart was preparing me for the inevitable. I thought about the law and how it would see me. I thought about neighbors, about family, about newspapers that might one day print my name beneath the cold word murder. Yet none of those images frightened me as much as the idea of him dying slowly, begging for peace while I stood powerless. I realized then that the true betrayal would be inaction, to let him slip away piece by piece until nothing of the man I loved remained. There were nights when I sat by his bed and wept silently, not from weakness, but from the crushing weight of the choice before me. I pressed my face into the blanket to muffle the sound, knowing he stirred even at the faintest noise. My tears were not only for him, but for the life we had built together, for the years that had carried us from youth to this final threshold. I felt as though I was standing at a doorway with no return, holding the key in my hand, knowing that once I stepped through, everything would change. I began to write in a notebook, something I had not done in years. I filled the pages with memories, our first dance, our children's births, the trips we had taken, the countless mornings that had begun with coffee and laughter. I wrote because I needed to remind myself that our story was larger than this ending, that what I was about to do did not erase the life we had lived, but honored it in a way words could never capture. Each page became a shield against the guilt that threatened to consume me. The decision was not made in one moment, but in 1,000 small ones. Every pill I crushed into powder, every spoon I lifted to his lips, every sigh that escaped his mouth, it all led me here. Love had brought me joy, companionship, and comfort. Now it demanded a sacrifice that tore at the very fabric of who I was. Yet I knew deep inside that this was not the end of our love. It was its most painful expression. And so, in the quiet of our home, surrounded by the echoes of a life we had shared, I accepted the burden. I would give him what he asked for without words. I would carry the weight of it on my shoulders, no matter the cost. Because love, true love, was never about saving myself. It was about saving him. The night arrived without announcement, though I had felt its approach for weeks, maybe months. There was a weight in the air, a subtle change in the rhythm of the house, as if even the walls anticipated what was to come. The clock on the mantel ticked with a strange insistence, every sound echoing louder than it had before, marking not just the passage of time, but the countdown of a life. Outside, the moonlight filtered through the curtains, laying pale silver strips across the floor, soft and merciless at once. I sat beside his bed, as I always did, but that night every detail carved itself deeper into my memory. His chest rose and fell with visible struggle, each breath jagged, like the labor of someone climbing a steep hill with no summit in sight. His lips, once quick to smile or whisper some private thought, were pale and cracked. His eyes opened briefly, heavy with exhaustion, but they sought mine. It was in that gaze, fragile yet unflinching, that I felt the silent plea again, stronger than ever. There were no words, but none were needed. The glass of water stood ready on the nightstand, the small objects arranged with deliberate care earlier in the day. My hands trembled as I reached for them. The air was so still that I could hear the faint shift of the bed sheets as his fingers twitched against the blanket. I placed my palm gently over his, anchoring him to me, or perhaps anchoring myself to him. The decision I had carried for so long was no longer abstract. It was here, demanding action, and there was no one else in the world but the two of us. His eyes fluttered closed, then opened again, weaker this time, as if he was slipping further into a place I could not follow. I lifted his head slightly, cradling him the way one would cradle a child, though he had been the strength of my life for so many years. I whispered nothing because words felt inadequate. Instead, I moved with slow precision, guiding him through the last ritual we would ever share. My hand steadied, not because the fear had gone, but because love steadied me. He swallowed, and then the room grew impossibly quiet. The hum of the oxygen machine seemed to recede, its rhythm no longer in harmony with his own. I watched the tension in his face dissolve, the lines of pain smoothing into something almost peaceful. His eyes closed fully, and his hand relaxed in mine. For a moment, I held my breath, waiting, watching, hoping that perhaps he would stir, that the moment had not yet come. But the stillness grew deeper, heavier, until it settled over me like a shroud. I kept my hand on his chest, feeling the faint flutter weaken, then fade entirely. It was not abrupt, but gradual, like the tide pulling away from the shore. And then it was gone. His heart, which had beaten beside mine for 60 years, ceased its work, leaving a silence so absolute it seemed to swallow the world. I pressed my ear against his chest, desperate for one more sound, but there was only the hollow quiet of absence. Tears welled, though they came slowly, as if even grief needed time to take hold. I sat with him in that silence, refusing to move, unwilling to disturb the fragile stillness that now belonged to death. The lamp's glow softened his features, casting them in a serenity that had been missing for so long. He looked less like a man in pain and more like the boy I had fallen in love with, the one who had walked toward me across a crowded dance floor all those years ago. I smoothed the blanket over him, though I knew he no longer felt its warmth. I stroked his hair, now white and thin, recalling the countless mornings I had run my fingers through it absent-mindedly while he read the newspaper. Every memory seemed to rise at once, crowding the room. The first kiss we had shared, the day we brought our first child home, the evenings when he returned from work with dirt on his hands and a smile that belonged only to me. Each moment layered itself onto this final one, weaving a tapestry that both comforted and crushed me. The night stretched on endlessly. I did not sleep. I could not. I sat in the chair by his bed, my hand still entwined with his cooling fingers, unwilling to let go. The world outside continued as though nothing had changed. The occasional car passing on the road, the rustle of wind through the trees. But within these walls, everything had altered beyond recognition. Time had stopped with him. I thought about how the law would view what I had done, how society would brand me, how whispers might circulate among neighbors and strangers alike. Yet none of those thoughts carried weight compared to the gravity of the moment I had just witnessed. All that mattered was that his suffering had ended, that he had left this world not in agony, but in peace. I held to that truth like a lifeline, even as guilt crept into the corners of my mind. I rose once, in the earliest hours of dawn, to close the window where the breeze had turned sharp. The first hint of morning painted the horizon in muted grays, and the world seemed reluctant to wake. When I returned to his side, I found myself whispering a prayer without realizing it, not for forgiveness, but for his safe passage, for the hope that somewhere beyond my reach he had found rest. As the sun finally broke over the horizon, the room filled with a dim golden light that touched his face gently. It was as though the day itself came to acknowledge his departure. I sat there, exhausted but resolute, my eyes fixed on him, unwilling to let the moment slip into the ordinary. That night would remain carved into me forever, the night when his heart stopped, the night when love demanded its final act, and the night when silence became the loudest sound I had ever known. The courthouse loomed above me like a monument carved out of stone and judgment. Its steps were broad, worn down by the weight of countless feet, and as I climbed them, I felt as though I was ascending not into a building, but into the heart of condemnation itself. Inside, the air smelled of varnish, dust, and authority. The ceiling stretched high, as if reminding everyone who entered that the law stood taller than any one life, taller than any one act of mercy. I clutched my small purse to my chest as though it could shield me, though I knew there was nothing in it that could offer protection. When I entered the courtroom, rows of wooden benches creaked beneath strangers who had gathered to witness my judgment. Their faces were turned toward me, some curious, some skeptical, others indifferent. I lowered my gaze, not out of shame, but out of exhaustion. My heart still lived in that small room at home where Robert had breathed his last. Everything beyond those four walls felt foreign, and yet here I was, thrust into a world where love was dissected with cold precision and stripped of its tenderness. The prosecutor's voice filled the chamber, sharp and exacting, cutting through the silence like a blade. He spoke of intent, of premeditation, of my decision to end a human life. He painted pictures of guilt with broad strokes, words like murder and crime, hanging in the air heavier than iron. Each syllable landed on my shoulders, pressing me further down, as if daring me to crumble under their weight. To him, I was not a wife, not a woman who had lived through 6 decades of companionship, but a criminal whose actions required punishment. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, my eyes fixed on the polished surface of the table before me. The wood reflected the courtroom lights in thin streaks, and I stared at them until they blurred, trying to keep my composure. I felt every eye on me, searching for signs of regret or malice. But what they sought I could not give them. My sorrow was too deep to be displayed, my reasoning too personal to be translated into the sterile language of the law. When the defense spoke on my behalf, their words felt softer but no less powerless. They described compassion, love, promises made in the dark between husband and wife. They attempted to show that my act had not been born of cruelty, but of devotion. Yet I could sense how their words faltered against the unyielding wall of the law. The law did not care for promises whispered in the quiet of a home, nor for the intimate understanding between two souls who had built a life together. It cared only for definitions, for absolutes, for the sanctity of life in the abstract, even when that life had become unbearable in reality. The jury sat in silence, their faces unreadable, their expressions carved in neutrality. I looked at them briefly and saw youth, faces unlined by decades of marriage or the burden of caring for a body that once carried dreams, but now carried only suffering. I wondered if they could ever understand, if any of them had ever sat through a night listening to the labored breaths of someone they loved, wishing for mercy, but shackled by fear of consequence. To them, perhaps, this was a simple question: had I ended his life or not? To me, it was not a question at all, but the fulfillment of a promise. The judge's gavel struck at intervals, sharp cracks that punctuated the proceedings like a drumbeat. Each time the sound echoed, I felt my body jolt, as though I were being reminded again and again that this was real, that my life as I had known it was slipping further away. My memories of Robert seemed almost fragile in such a place, like delicate photographs being exposed to harsh light until they faded. I wanted to hold them close, shield them from this courtroom, but they were all I had left, and the walls of justice felt eager to strip them from me. Witnesses were called, neighbors, nurses, people who had stepped briefly into our world and caught glimpses of his suffering. They spoke of his decline, of my devotion, of the care I gave him day after day. Yet even their words, kind though they were, turned into something else under questioning. The prosecutor twisted their observations into evidence of planning, of intent. Their sympathy became another chain around my wrists, binding me to guilt I could not escape. Through it all, I remained silent. My lawyer had told me to answer only what was asked, but the truth was, I had no strength for protest. My truth was not something that could be packaged neatly into testimony. It lived in the quiet moments of our life together, in the silent prayers, in the touch of his hand against mine as he slipped away. No courtroom could hold those truths. They were too fragile, too sacred. When it was my turn to speak, I stood slowly, feeling the weight of years in my bones. The room blurred before me as I placed my hands on the wooden rail, steadying myself. I told them only that I had loved him, that I had promised him he would not suffer, that I had done what I believed was right. My voice wavered but did not break. There was no argument in my words, no defense, only the raw honesty of a woman who had walked beside her husband until the very end and refused to abandon him to agony. I did not ask for their forgiveness because I did not believe they could grant it. Forgiveness belonged to him, and he had already given it with his final smile. When I sat down again, the room seemed colder. The faces of the jury remained still, their eyes shifting slightly as they looked at me, perhaps searching for remorse or certainty. I wondered what they saw: an old woman clinging to a story of love, or a criminal cloaking her crime in sentiment. The line between those two identities was razor thin, and I no longer knew on which side I stood. The day stretched on, hours blending together until time itself felt suspended. By the time the gavel struck to adjourn, my body ached with fatigue, but my heart felt oddly calm. I had faced the law with the truth as I knew it, and whatever came next would be beyond my control. As I was led from the courtroom, the murmur of voices rose behind me, strangers debating my fate, strangers who would never know the depth of the life I had lived or the love I had honored. I walked through the narrow corridor back into the holding cell, the door closing behind me with a metallic clang. The sound reverberated through me, sealing me away not only from the outside world, but from the life I had once known. In that moment, I understood with chilling clarity. The world might see my act as a crime, but in my heart, it would always remain an act of love. The first night in the cell was not marked by sleep, but by the harsh awakening of reality. The door clanged shut with a sound that seemed to reverberate through my bones, leaving me in a square of concrete that was colder than anything I had ever known. The cot sagged beneath my weight, its thin mattress pressing the metal frame against my back. The smell of disinfectant mingled with sweat and damp air, a sharp reminder that this place belonged to no one, yet claimed everyone. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, tracing the cracks in the plaster as though they might form a map out of this confinement. Morning arrived with the echo of boots on the corridor floor and the metallic rattle of keys. The air was thick with voices, shouts, laughter, curses. I rose slowly, my body aching not from age alone, but from the heavy burden of judgment. Around me, other women moved with a restless energy. They laughed loudly, fought bitterly, or whispered secrets through the bars. I was a stranger among them, my years marking me as an anomaly in this world of the young and hardened. Their eyes flickered toward me with curiosity, suspicion, or sometimes pity, but rarely with understanding. Days passed in a rhythm that was both relentless and monotonous. Meals arrived on metal trays, portions of food so bland they seemed designed to strip life of any pleasure. I learned to eat slowly, not for the taste, but for the ritual of passing time. The walls absorbed every sound, the scrape of chairs, the slam of doors, the endless hum of fluorescent lights. Nights were punctuated by the distant clang of gates and the muffled sobs of women who could not hide their despair. Time became shapeless, stretching and contracting unpredictably, leaving me unmoored in its current. At first, I sat silently, an outsider to the chaos around me. But silence has its own gravity, and eventually others were drawn to it. A young woman with tattoos covering her arms asked if I had children, her voice more curious than kind. Another left an extra piece of bread on my tray without explanation. Slowly, the edges of my isolation softened. They began to seek me out, not for entertainment or gossip, but for something else. They sat beside me during recreation hours, their voices spilling stories of abandonment, betrayal, addiction. I listened, not offering advice, only presence. My silence became a kind of mirror in which they saw their own grief reflected without judgment. I discovered that I carried a strength I had not known before. Perhaps it was age, or perhaps it was the weight of my past, but nothing they confessed shocked me. Their anger and despair were familiar, though shaped differently than mine. I began to realize that my suffering, though unique, was not solitary. Pain connected us, weaving threads between women who otherwise had little in common. My story, when I chose to share it, was met with a stillness that surprised me. They did not laugh or condemn. Some nodded, others lowered their eyes. A few whispered that they understood what it meant to watch someone suffer helplessly. The guards saw me differently, too. They regarded me less as a threat and more as a curiosity, a grandmotherly figure who did not fit the mold of defiance or violence. They called me ma'am, sometimes with respect, sometimes with irony, but always with a distance that left me in a peculiar place, neither fully part of the inmates nor fully part of authority. I existed in the in-between, a quiet observer in a place defined by noise. I began to find purpose in small acts, folding sheets neatly when others tossed them carelessly, picking up scraps of paper in the common room, offering my seat to someone younger when benches grew crowded. These gestures were not grand, but they stitched together the remnants of my dignity. They reminded me that even in confinement, I could choose how to carry myself, how to honor the life I had lived before these walls closed in. Books became another refuge. The prison library was sparse, its shelves lined with worn paperbacks and outdated encyclopedias, but within those pages I rediscovered fragments of myself. Stories reminded me of the library where I had once worked, of afternoons spent guiding children to books that might change their lives. I read slowly, savoring every word, letting the language transport me beyond the walls. Sometimes other women asked me to read aloud, and I did, my voice steady, carrying narratives of worlds far from this one. In those moments, silence would fall over the room, and even the most restless souls seemed to lean closer. At night, lying on the cot with a thin blanket pulled up to my chin, I reflected on what had brought me there. Regret and acceptance battled quietly within me. I did not regret loving him, nor did I regret keeping my promise, but I struggled with the label the world had placed upon me. Murderer! The word had no place in my heart, yet it echoed through the halls of the prison, attached to my name in the files locked in the warden's office. I tried to separate myself from it, to remind myself that the truth of who I was lived not in paperwork, but in memory, in the love that had defined my life. I realized that prison, for all its cruelty, offered me something I had not expected. It gave me time stripped bare of distraction, time to reckon with the enormity of what I had done and what it meant. The walls did not allow escape, but they forced introspection. In those long hours, I searched for meaning, for a way to reconcile my act of love with the condemnation it had earned me. Slowly, I began to understand that meaning was not something handed down by courts or written into laws. It was something I carried within, shaped by memory, by devotion, by the choices that defined my life. As seasons shifted beyond the barred windows, I noticed that my fear had lessened. The dread that had accompanied me into the cell, the weight of judgment, began to fade. What remained was a quiet resolve. I was not free, not in the way the outside world defined freedom, but I was not entirely imprisoned either. Within those walls, I carved out a small sanctuary of thought and remembrance. I learned that even in the most barren places, love could root itself and grow, invisible yet unshakable. And so the cell, once a place of punishment, became something else. It became the chamber where I wrestled with guilt, where I discovered strength, where I understood that meaning was not lost even when freedom was. It was here, among concrete and iron, that I searched for a truth I could live with, and though I knew the world might never accept it, I carried it within me like a quiet flame, steady and unextinguished. The years unfolded inside those walls with a strange elasticity, sometimes dragging like heavy chains across the floor, sometimes vanishing in a blink, leaving me startled at how much time had passed. I marked the seasons not by holidays or family gatherings, but by the subtle changes in the yard, the way frost spread across the wire fences in winter, the sudden bloom of weeds pushing stubbornly through cracks in summer. The world beyond continued in its rhythm, but I inhabited a different calendar, one made of repetition, small rituals, and the slow work of coming to terms with what I had done. At first, I thought redemption would be something grand, a moment when clarity would descend and erase my doubts. I imagined that perhaps, one day, I would feel forgiven by God, by society, by myself. But as the years gathered behind me, I began to understand that redemption was quieter, less dramatic. It came in fragments, in the smallest gestures, in the daily decision to live with dignity in a place that tried to strip dignity away. I found it when I listened to the younger women who sat beside me, pouring out their pain in unpolished words. Some had been abandoned, some had been betrayed, many had never known tenderness at all. They asked me why I was there, and though I never gave the full details, I told them enough for them to sense that love had shaped my crime. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others nodded with eyes that softened. Each time I shared a piece of myself, I felt the weight inside me shift slightly, as if grief became lighter when divided. I found redemption, too, in the mundane tasks that became anchors, sweeping the floor of the common room with deliberate care, folding sheets with neat corners, writing letters to no one in particular that I never mailed. I wrote to Robert often, addressing him as though he could still read my words. I told him about the sounds of the prison at night, about the women who argued and laughed, about the moments when I sat under the weak light of the yard and thought of him. I filled pages with my longing, my regrets, and my gratitude for the years we had shared. The letters remained in a small pile under my mattress, a hidden archive of love and penance. There were nights when I dreamed of him. In those dreams, he was whole again, strong, walking toward me across a field bathed in sunlight. He did not speak, but his smile told me all I needed to know. I would wake with tears soaking the thin pillow, but also with a sense of peace, as though he had come to remind me that I had not betrayed him, that my choice had been one of mercy. Those dreams became my lifeline, a sacred place where forgiveness lived. The other women began to call me Grandma, not mockingly, but with a kind of reverence. They came to me for advice they did not follow, for comfort they did not always accept, but always they returned. I listened without judgment, and they, in turn, offered me small acts of kindness, an extra piece of fruit from the cafeteria, a folded note with a drawing, a quiet presence beside me during long hours in the yard. In those exchanges, I felt redemption as something shared, not solitary. My life had been reduced to these walls, but within them I found purpose in being a steady presence for others adrift. I often thought of the word guilty, the word that had been stamped on me in the courtroom. I carried it like a scar, visible to all who looked at me through the lens of the law. But inside myself, I began to redefine it. Guilty, yes, of ending a life, but not guilty of cruelty, not guilty of indifference. I was guilty of loving too much, of keeping a promise that demanded everything of me, and perhaps that was a guilt I could live with. When I walked the small square of the prison yard, I looked up at the sky. It was the same sky that stretched above our home, the same sky he had once gazed at from the porch in the evenings. Clouds drifted, stars returned, the moon waxed and waned. The sky was vast, indifferent, eternal, and under it, I was just a woman who had loved and lost, who had acted out of mercy and borne the cost. Somehow, in that vastness, my pain seemed smaller, my act less monstrous, my life still part of something greater. Redemption came in the way I learned to forgive myself, not in a single moment, but slowly, like dawn creeping over the horizon. It came when I stopped asking whether the world would ever understand me. It came when I accepted that my truth might never align with the law's truth. It came when I realized that forgiveness was not something others could grant me, but something I had to grow within. In the end, I knew I would die within these walls. My body had grown weaker, my hair thinner, my hands more frail. Yet I did not fear that end. I feared only that I might forget who I had been before the bars, before the sentence. So I held on to memory fiercely, polishing it like a stone I kept in my pocket. I recalled his laughter, his voice, the warmth of his hand. Those memories became my sanctuary, a place untouched by chains or judgments. And there, in that sanctuary, I finally found redemption. Not the redemption of absolution or applause, but the redemption of knowing I had remained true to love, even when love demanded everything of me. It was a quiet redemption, one that lived in silence, in endurance, in the steady rhythm of my heart carrying his memory forward. I understood at last that redemption was not about erasing the past. It was about living with it, carrying it like a lantern in the dark, allowing its light to guide me through the shadows. And as I sat on the hard bench in the yard, the sun warming my face, I felt a peace that had eluded me for years. I had kept my promise. I had borne the cost. And in that, I had found the closest thing to freedom that prison could ever give me.